Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the quorum.
The Senate's in a quorum call.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I am really pleased that we have reached an agreement that will reopen the government and allow us to pay our bills and provide a path forward now for bipartisan budget negotiations. As part of this bipartisan deal, I will once again tonight ask unanimous consent to begin a bipartisan budget conference. The budgets that passed the Senate and House 6 months ago are very different. Nobody thinks it's going to be easy to get to a deal, but I know I would not have fought so hard for so long to begin bipartisan negotiations if I didn't think we could find some common ground and work something out. Mr. President, I don't think there's anyone in Congress who wants to put the country through the last few weeks again. And I'm hopeful that we can now work together.
The Senate will be in order.
Mr. President, I am hopeful that we can now work together in a budget conference to end these constant crises and work now towards a balanced and bipartisan deal that the American people expect and deserve. So I tonight ask unanimous consent that if the Senate passes H.R. 2775 as amended, the Senate then proceed to the consideration of calendar number 33, H. Con. Res. 25, that the amendment at the desk, which is the text of S. Con. Res. 8, the budget resolution passed by the Senate be agreed to, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, that H. Con. Res. 25 as amended be agreed to, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, that the motion for the Senate to insist on its amendment be agreed to, the Senate request a conference with the House on the disagreeing votes of the two houses, and authorize the chair to appoint conferees on the part of the Senate with a ratio of 12 Democrats and 10 Republicans, that the conferees be instructed to report back a conference report by December 13, 2013, that if the Senate receives from the House a request to go to conference on S. Con. Res. 8, this agreement be modified so that the Senate agree to the request to go to conference on S. Con. Res. 8 with the remaining provisions related to the conference remaining in effect. Further, that it not be in order for the Senate to consider a conference report with respect to H. Con. Res. 25 or S. Con. Res. 8 if it includes reconciliation instructions to raise the debt limit, and that all the above occur with no intervening action or debate, and finally, that H. Con. Res. 25 as amended and passed be held at the desk until a message is received from the House relative to H.R. 2775, and if the House fails to concur in the Senate amendment to H.R. 2775, this agreement be vitiated.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to consideration of calendar number 193, which is H.R. 2775. The substitute amendment, which is the desk, be agreed to. That a cloture motion on the bill as amended, which is the desk, then be read, that the mandatory quorum required under Rule 22 be waived, and no other amendments, points of order, or motions be in order to the bill. The Senate then proceed to vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the bill as amended, that if cloture is invoked, all post-cloture time be yielded back, and the bill as amended be read a third time, and the Senate proceed to vote on passage of the bill as amended. If the bill as amended is passed, that a title amendment, which is the desk, be agreed to. Finally, that if cloture is not invoked, action above with respect to the amendment to the bill be vitiated, and the bill will be returned to the calendar.
Is there objection? Without objection. So ordered. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to the consideration of H.R. 2775, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 193, H.R. 2775, an act to condition the provision of premiums and cost-sharing subsidies under the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and so forth and for other purposes.
Under the previous order, amendment number 2004 is agreed to. Under the previous order, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close debate on H.R. 2775 as amended, signed by 16 senators as follows: Reed of Nevada, Durbin, Murray, Boxer, Leahy, Whitehouse, Stabenow, Bennett, Rockefeller, Tester, Reed of Rhode Island, Warner, Kane, Cardin, Schumer, and Coons.
Okay. By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate the debate on H.R. 2775 as amended shall be brought to a close? The ayes and nays are mandatory. Under the rule, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Aye. Ms. Ayotte.
Aye.
Ms. Baldwin. Aye. Mr. Barrasso.
Aye. They said, here's the bus. And they said, yeah, that's Amen.
You know, the younger people look at my
And you know what?
Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chiesa.
Dick? I had a guy talking to me about it yesterday, 21.
Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin.
I've got it all. Okay, perfect. Okay, but I'm not saying Mr. Rubin's going to do that. Right. All right.
Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King.
Marcel's covering for me at the dinner.
Mr. Kirk.
When we announce the vote, who's going to show it?
Ms. Klobuchar.
It's coming right after. And she's going to say,
Ms. Landrieu.
can I then grab, I won't be able to go to dinner. Can I take a 10 o'clock flight out of here? Sure, easy. You don't need it tomorrow. I can come back.
Mr. Leahy.
I've done so many dams.
Mr. Lee.
Great. Let me go.
Mr. Levin.
Oh, you'll be over. But Harry, you're going to make a big deal.
Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill.
Okay, I'll be right back.
Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada.
Where you going?
Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Baldwin, Barrasso, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt, Boxer, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Chambliss, Chiesa, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Donnelly, Durbin, Fisher, Flake, Franken, Gillibrand, Graham, Hagan, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Hoven, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Manchin, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Murray, Portman, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden. Mr. Vitter voted in the negative. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Roberts, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Kirk, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Rubio, no. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Cornyn, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Heller, no. Mr. Grassley, no. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Enzi, no.
To be order, please. On this vote, the yeas are 83. The nays are 16. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn, having voted in the affirmative, the motion is agreed to. Under the previous order, cloture having been invoked, all time is yielded back. The clerk will read the title of the bill for the third time.
Calendar number 193, H.R. 2775. An act to condition the provision of premium and cost-sharing subsidies and so forth and for other purposes.
The question occurs on the passage of H.R. 2775 as amended. Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Beckich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Mr. King. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill.
Hey, thanks for the balcony. Good.
Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski. Aye. Mr. Warren. Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman. Yes. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller.
Who's in the middle?
Who's in the middle? Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz. Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions. Oh, good. Mrs. Shaheen.
So your work is aware of it, you'll make up for it.
Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren.
Next road to Chicago.
Who? Oh. Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Aye for all ears. Senators voting in the affirmative. Senators voting in the affirmative. Alexander, Ayotte, Baldwin, Barrasso, Baucus, Bekich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Boxer, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Chambliss, Chiesa, Coates, Cochran, Collins, Coons, Corker, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Fisher, Flake, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Hoban, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, McCain, McCaskill, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Moran, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Portman, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Wyden. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Coburn, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Heller, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, Paul, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Toomey, and Vitter. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Graham? Aye.
On this vote, there are 81 yeas, 18 nays. The bill is reported as is passed and as amended, and under the previous order, the title amendment is agreed to. Without objection, the motion is agreed to. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to the consideration of Econ Res 25, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 33, H-Con Res 25, establishing the budget for the United States government for fiscal year 2014 and setting forth appropriate budgetary levels for fiscal years 2015 through 2023.
And under the previous order, amendment number 2006 is agreed to. The motion to reconsider considered made, laid upon the table. H-Con Res 25 is amended is agreed to. The motion to reconsider is considered. Made and laid on the table. And the Senate insists on its amendment, requests a conference with the House on the disagreeing votes of the two houses. Conferees are instructed to report back by December 13, 2013, and the chair is authorized to appoint conferees on the part of the Senate. There. An absence of quorum has been requested. Absence of quorum is noted. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
So after 16 days of a government shutdown, the Senate just approved a measure to reopen the government and extend the debt limit. The vote was 81 to 18. 51 votes were needed to pass. And now that the Senate has voted, it goes over to the House, and on that side of the Capitol, the House has accelerated the process for considering the Senate-passed bill, meaning the Rules Committee will not need to meet to consider the bill. The Washington Times writes that House Speaker Boehner said that he and his fellow Republicans in the lower chamber will not block the debt deal that Senate leaders reached today. Mr. Boehner is saying that the House fought with everything that it has to try to win more concessions on Obamacare and spending cuts and vowed to continue fighting, but not on this bill. So we expect the House to vote shortly, which you can see on our companion network, C-SPAN. The President is also expected to speak, reacting to the vote, at about 8:25 Eastern Time, a few minutes from now, and you can also see that on C-SPAN. So now that the Senate has voted to approve the measure that would allow the Treasury to borrow normally through February 7th and fund the government through January 15th, it now goes over to the House, and that vote can be seen live on C-SPAN. Here in the Senate, it passed with a vote of 81 to 18. 51 votes were needed for passage. And a few of the senators who voted no, going to read some of them now. Senators Crapo, Enzi, Grassley, also Senator Rubio, Sessions, and Shelby. Some of the no votes on that Senate vote on the whether to fund the government through January 15th. Here's what started the day. The announcement with the deal was Senators Reid and McConnell. We're going to watch that now.
The Majority Leader.
Could we have order in the Senate?
The Senate is in a quorum call.
I would ask, thank you for reminding me of that also. I ask unanimous consent to call the quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
Madam President, the eyes of the world have been in Washington all this week, and that is a gross understatement. And while they witnessed a great deal of political discord, today they will also see Congress reach a historic bipartisan agreement to reopen the government and avert a default on the nation's bills. The compromise we reached will provide our economy with the stability it desperately needs. It's never easy for two sides to reach consensus. It's really hard, sometimes harder than others. This time was really hard. But after weeks spent facing off across a partisan divide that often seemed too wide to cross, our country came to the brink of a disaster. But in the end, political adversaries set aside their differences and disagreements to prevent that disaster. I thank the Republican leader for his diligent efforts to reach this important agreement. The Republican leader's cooperation was essential to reach an accord that could pass both chambers of Congress and also be signed by President Obama. As part of our agreement, in order to assure Congress continues the work of setting this country on a path of fiscal sustainability, this legislation instructs leaders to name conferees to a budget conference committee that will set our country on a long-term path to fiscal sustainability. Madam President, I know that some say that's going to be hard. But what we do is hard here, and this is really hard, but I think we can get it done. The committee members selected must have open minds, be willing to consider every option, no matter how painful to their own political ideas and even their own political parties. This conference committee, led by Chairman Murray and Chairman Ryan, which will produce its negotiated budget resolution in December, is the appropriate place to discuss our different views of the best way to chart a course for economic growth. This legislation also funds the government through January 15th and averts default through February 7th, during which time we can work toward a long-term budget agreement that prevents these frequent crises. And perhaps most importantly, this legislation ends a standoff to ground the work of Washington to a halt this fall. Madam President, this is not a time for pointing fingers of blame. This is a time of reconciliation. I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of this great Capitol to pass this remarkable agreement which will protect the long-term health of our economy and avert a default on our nation's debt and allow us to set a foundation for economic expansion. What we've done is send a message to Americans from every one of our 50 states. But in addition to that, to the citizens of every country in the world, that the United States lives up to its obligations. Now Congress must return to its most important job, fostering economic growth and protecting middle-class families. I appreciate through all this the steady hand of President Obama who helped guide us to this conclusion. I'm optimistic that the spirit of compromise that has taken root in the Senate over the last 2 days will endure. I do know this. Senator McConnell and I have sat in very, very serious discussions the last few days. We're going to do everything we can to change the atmosphere in the Senate and accomplish things that need to be done for our country.
Madam President.
The Republican leader.
This has been a long, challenging few weeks for Congress and for the country. It's my hope that today we can put some of those most urgent issues behind us. After yesterday's events, the Majority Leader and I began a series of conversations about a way to get the government reopened and to prevent default. I'm confident we'll be able to do both those things later today. Crucially, I'm also confident that we'll be able to announce that we're protecting the government spending reductions that both parties agreed to under the Budget Control Act and that the President signed into law. That's been a top priority for me and for my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle throughout this debate, and it's been worth the effort. Some have suggested that we break that promise as part of this agreement. Some have said Washington needs to spend more. that we need to raise taxes, that we need to just tax our way to prosperity and balance. But what the BCA showed is that Washington actually can cut spending. And because of this law, that's just what we've done. For the first time since the Korean War, government spending has declined for 2 years in a row, the first time in 50 years. And we're not going back on this agreement. There's a lot more we need to do to get our nation's fiscal house in order. Hopefully, once we've gotten past the drama of the moment, we can get to work on it. But for now, let's not understate the importance of the Budget Control Act or the importance of the fight to preserve it. This legislation is the largest spending reduction bill of the last quarter century and the largest deficit reduction bill since 1981 that didn't include a tax hike. Preserving this law is critically important to the future of our country. Throughout this debate, the public has rightly focused on Obamacare, for good reason. This law is ravaging our economy, killing jobs, driving up premiums, and driving people off the health care plans they have and like in droves. Its disastrous rollout is a sign of even worse things to come. And the refusal to delay it reflects a kind of stubborn ideological obsession that will do untold damage to our country. And Republicans remain determined to repeal this terrible law. But for today, the relief we hope for is to reopen the government, avoid default, and protect the historic cuts we achieved under the Budget Control Act. This is far less than many of us had hoped for, frankly, but it's far better than what some had sought. Now it's time for Republicans to unite behind other crucial goals. Madam President, I yield the floor.
President Obama just finished remarks at the White House after the Senate voted to reopen the government and raise the debt limit. President Obama has said that he will sign the bill if it's approved by the House. Dana Bash of CNN sent a tweet saying that House Republican leadership aides are flabbergasted that POTUS came out to speak before the House vote. The vote is delicate for many House Republicans, according to Dana Bash of CNN. Those House votes will be live shortly on C-SPAN. And the final vote here in the Senate was 81-18. Some of those no votes included Senators Lee, Johnson of Wisconsin, Paul, Roberts, and also Senator Rubio, who spoke on the Senate floor earlier today about his opposition.
Mr. President, it now appears that at some point this evening we will reach the end of the latest Washington manufactured crisis of the month. But unfortunately, the real crisis facing our country remains. And that real crisis is the growing sense among our people that we are losing the American dream. Why do people feel this way? Because more than 4 million Americans have been out of work for 6 months or more. Because millions more find themselves stuck with jobs that do not pay enough for them to live the way they used to. And while their paychecks aren't growing, their bills are. Ask the young couples and the single parents how much they're spending every month to provide child care for their children. Ask the students, the young Americans who are stuck with thousands of dollars in student loans that they're now struggling to pay. This is the real crisis facing America, that our status as a land of opportunity seems to be eroding, and that so many of our political leaders seem oblivious to this. And now, as we emerge from this latest standoff, we have done nothing to address it. There were two issues at play in this showdown. The press coverage mixes them together, but they're two distinct and separate issues, and they should be examined that way. It started with Obamacare, a law that was sold to people as something that would help them get affordable health insurance. But that is not what it's going to be. We've all heard the news of what a fiasco the rollout of the exchanges has been. But as bad as the rollout of the exchanges and this website has been, we need to realize that that was supposed to be the easy part. The most difficult and disruptive parts of that law are yet to come. In the months to come, a new insurance fee, a new tax on hard-working Americans will be added to insurance policies. People will be required to give up existing coverage that they are happy with if it doesn't meet the standards created by Obamacare. And if they don't buy the insurance, they eventually will have to pay a tax that goes up to either $695 a year or 2.5% of your income. Employers with more than 50 full-time employees will be required to offer a certain type of coverage to their employees. So many of them are moving people to part-time work. And full-time, by the way, is no longer defined as 40 hours. It's now 30 hours. So many employers are moving employees to under 30 hours a week. Today, for many Americans, Obamacare is just a website that doesn't work. But in the months to come, this law is going to hurt millions of people. It's going to cost them hours at work and maybe even their job. It's going to cost them the insurance that they have now and are happy with. It's going to force them to leave their existing doctor, and it's going to raise rates for people who buy insurance for themselves. What do we tell these people that are being hurt by this law? To deal with it because it's the law of the land? Is it not our job to fight for them? Is it not our job to be their voice, to protect them from the harmful effects of this law? And that's why I continue to believe that we should not waste a single penny more of taxpayer money on this damaging law. One of the most important powers and responsibilities that we have as members of Congress is the power of the purse. It's under our Constitution. It gives the Congress the power to decide what to spend money on and what not to spend money on from the taxpayer. Now, I know of no one in my party who supported shutting down the government. On the contrary, we argued that we should fund the entire government except for one thing, Obamacare. In fact, the House of Representatives passed a law that did just that. But the Democrats took the position that either we fund Obamacare or we fund nothing at all. They took the position that funding Obamacare was more important than funding the government. And they were willing to put our country through this government shutdown just to save their pet project. Within days of this showdown, by the way, a second issue was added to it, the federal debt limit. Now, the press portrays the debt limit as simply a law that allows us to pay our bills. And therefore, they fall for the argument that failing to raise the debt limit means or equals a default on our debt. But the debt limit is a lot more than just simply permission to pay our bills. Every year, our government is spending more money than it takes in, a lot more money than it takes in. And as the years go by, that annual deficit adds up to what we call the national debt. And it's growing at an alarming rate. The debt limit is a law that limits the amount of money the government can have as debt at any single time. But we depend on borrowed money to pay our bills. And so if we don't raise it again, eventually we will not have enough money to pay all of our bills. That should scare us. Reaching the debt limit is like when the bank calls on you to collect on the monthly mortgage payment. If you don't pay them, your home is going to be taken away, your credit's going to be ruined, and your ability to borrow money in the future is going to be hurt. But what if, because you don't make enough money, the only way you can pay your mortgage is by using your credit card? You can't keep doing that forever. And so when the bank calls, you pay the bill, but you also figure out what other expenses to cut so you don't have to keep using your credit card to pay the mortgage. That's what real people in the real world would do. But that's not what we're being asked to do here. They're asking us to just pay the bill and keep using the credit card and let tomorrow worry about tomorrow. We can't keep doing that forever, because at some point even the credit card is going to stop working. Yet that's what's happened here again. And so the debt will keep growing, and with each passing year, we will get closer to the day that we face a real debt crisis. A real debt crisis. Not one caused because the Congress can't pass a bill, but one caused because no one will lend us money anymore. And that's how we arrived at the point we find ourselves at today. We have a president and a majority in the Senate that would rather face a default before seriously dealing with the debt. We have a president and a majority in this Senate that would rather shut down the government before they would shut down Obamacare or even make any meaningful changes to it. So tonight, the government will be reopened and the debt limit will be lifted, but our real problems are still here. And in the months and years to come, they are only going to get bigger and harder to solve. And for those of us who realize this, who clearly understand that the direction we are headed threatens the American dream and all the things that make our country special, this is the time to reflect on the way forward. Because if we do not figure out how to change course around here, if we do not figure out the way to change this course our nation is on, we will forever be known as the generation that ushered in America's decline. And history's not going to distinguish between Republicans and Democrats. It will judge us all harshly for our failure to act. To avoid this fate, we must once and for all begin to address the national debt. Not with accounting gimmicks, but with real and measurable steps. It doesn't have to be solved in one sweeping measure, but we must begin the work of moving towards a sustainable level of spending. This will take time, because we're still saddled by too many leaders unwilling to address the issue in a meaningful way. So let's do what we can while they're still here. And at the same time, let's work to replace these irresponsible leaders on the left with leaders who will finally step up and save our nation from the real debt crisis that awaits us. As for Obamacare, it too will be harshly judged by history. And that's why I'm personally so disappointed that we were not able to achieve any meaningful changes to it. But this fight is not over. It's really only just begun. For in the months to come, millions of Americans will begin to confront the costs and the consequences of this law. It will be the reason why they're now working part-time. It will be the reason why they lost the insurance they used to have. It will be the reason why they can't see the doctor they've been seeing for all these years. It will be the reason why their insurance premiums have gone through the roof. We've been warning people about this for years, and we've done everything we can to keep this harm from reaching our people. But now Obamacare is going to start hurting real people in real ways, and when it does, there is going to be a mad scramble in this town to fix it or get rid of it. This has happened before. In June of 1988, Congress passed a bill called the Medicare Catastrophic Coverage Act. It promised new medical benefits for the elderly, a cap on hospital and doctor bills, provided prescription medicine. And then the true cost of the program began to reach the American people. And as seniors began to learn the true cost of this new program, it fueled a revolt. Now, at first, the politicians minimized it. They minimized the protest. They refused to make any changes to it. But before long, the onslaught of calls and mail was so much that it became impossible to ignore. And before long, Congress was in full retreat, and by 1989, it was fully replaced. Now, for Obamacare, that day of reckoning is also coming. You know, over the last few months, I've been startled by the number of people who have told me that they're ready to give up. They're ready to give up on the idea that we can make a difference. They're ready to give up on the idea that things will ever get better. But we cannot give up on America. And we cannot give up on the American dream. We cannot give up, because where are we going to go? If this country declines, if we lose what makes it special, what's going to replace it? And so no matter how long it takes, no matter how many disappointments lie ahead, we must never give up, and we must never accept that this way of life today is the new normal. As for those around the world who look at all these events of the last few days and believe that it's evidence that our best days are behind us, you don't understand our people. Our politics does not define our country. We are a unique people, a collection of men and women with sharply different views, with different backgrounds and beliefs. We share a free society, and everyone has a right to express their views, to argue and to battle and to debate. Sometimes our differences bring us to points of great conflict, when the nation appears on the verge of being ripped apart at the seams. But yet for over 200 years we have been held together, because while we're divided on many things, we are united by a powerful and timeless idea. Before I describe that idea, I'd like unanimous consent for one additional minute to conclude.
Without objection, so ordered.
For over 200 years, we've been held together because we're united by a powerful and timeless idea. The idea that every single person has the God-given right to determine the course of their own life. The God-given right to go as far as our talent and our work will take us. And so we argue about the best way to achieve that. And we have a tendency to put off difficult decisions until we absolutely have to make them. But we have faced greater tests before. We have not always rushed to meet the challenge, but in the end we have never failed to do so. And let there be no doubt, we will do so again. The day is coming when our people will realize that the time has arrived once again to confront the challenges before us. The day is coming when our people will do what must be done to keep the American dream alive. I know it's hard to see right now, but we are one day closer to the moment when Americans will do what we have always done. We will confront and solve the challenges of our time, and we will make any sacrifice and undertake any task to make sure that we leave for our children what the Americans of yesterday left for us, the single greatest nation in the history of the world. Mr. President.
Just a short time ago, President Obama thanked leaders from both parties for working out an agreement to end the government shutdown and raise the debt ceiling. Speaking after the Senate passed the bill, but before the House voted, Politico writes that the President said he plans to sign the legislation immediately, and the process of reopening the government will then begin immediately. Stephen Dennis of Roll Call sent a tweet that says, S&P says the shutdown cost $24 billion. The cost of Obamacare next year, $49 billion. The Senate vote was 81-18, and the House must still vote, which you can see at C-SPAN and cspan.org. And we're hearing from reporters that that House vote could come within a half hour. After 16 days of a government shutdown, the Senate approved a measure to reopen the government and extend the debt limit. The vote was 81 to 18. 51 votes were needed to pass. Congressional Quarterly writes that the Senate bill also includes a provision that would let Colorado receive as much as $450 million in emergency aid to rebuild from floods that damaged highways and bridges last month. That provision would lift an existing $100 million per state cap on emergency highway disaster aid. Manu Raju of Politico tweets that senators are being told no more votes until October 28th, and many of them are already on their flights home. We're going to take a look now at Senate Democratic leaders. They spoke on Capitol Hill just after the vote.
See it? It's the same one we printed up.
I'm tired. I'm very happy that we just completed a bipartisan vote to reopen the government and to avert a default on our bills. It'll be some time before we realize the effects of what we've just done. But the shutdown has hurt our economy to a significant degree. But we were able to work it out, so we're here, and no need to have any more losses. We've been able to come together for a lot of different reasons. I appreciate the work of a number of senators. But I think one of the most important things that we've been able to do is get Senator McConnell and I together. I'm very grateful that Senator Malone Alexander reached out to Senator Schumer, and being the peacemaker that he is, Lamar Alexander, suggested that they start doing what they could to engage Senator McConnell and I. And as a result of that, I think we're able to talk and hopefully develop really a strong relationship. Senator McConnell and I have worked together for many years. The last little bit, it's no surprise it hasn't been too good. So anyway, I appreciate the work that Senator Alexander, Senator Schumer did. I'm grateful for Senator Pryor and that gang of senators that they did some things that helped us. So I would hope that in the future the work that was done by Senator Pryor and Collins they'll be able to get together to create some separation here from all this shrill voice, these shrill voices we hear that really are not helpful. Averting this crisis is historic. But let's be honest. This is pain inflicted on our nation for no good reason, and we cannot make the same mistake again. So as we move into the next round of negotiations, I'm depending on stable, hardworking, always available Patty Murray. She is the stereotype of what I believe a senator should be. I'm very, very grateful to her for being willing to take the leadership of trying to work something out to make sure that we don't have another one of these crises, manufactured crises. She was called upon by the Democratic caucus to be the chair of the super committee, and she worked so hard, and we were so close, but as you know from all the experiences that the President had and I've had with Speaker Boehner, he was never able to take that step to accomplish this. I want to express here, probably the right place that would be on the Senate floor, for the support of my three leaders. Everyone knows my caucus has been locked strong together. We've worked with the President. We've been a real team. But one way we've been able to be a team is my team made the bigger team work. So I'm really grateful to them. No one will ever know the work that we do off the floor, behind the scenes. And I'm not a one-man show. I depend on these three good senators for virtually everything that we're able to accomplish. There's a lot more to do. As the President said yesterday, and I say today, let's move on. What is the big issue out there? People complain about the deficit. How about let's do immigration? $1 trillion, something that's fair and reasonable that this country's needed for a long time. So I look forward to the next venture is making sure we do immigration reform. We're going to continue extending our hands to the Republicans and hope they'll come to the table in good faith with the desire to compromise. Senator Durbin.
So many times throughout the history of the United States, it has taken the United States Senate to resolve national challenges and to resolve a national debate. It happened again tonight on the floor of the United States Senate. More than 80 senators from both political parties stood up and ended this 15-day ordeal that has been suffered by the people of the United States of America, by federal workers, and by those who depend on their good service. I can't describe to you the feeling on the floor during the course of these two votes. The bipartisanship, the camaraderie, the friendship that I felt. It was such a relief from what we've been through. Let's pray that this is just the beginning, and I think it is. I think there's a determination here to take this bipartisanship even further. We've seen it during the course of this year in a comprehensive immigration bill, the passage of a farm bill, and now the Senate, the bipartisan Senate, rose to the occasion and broke this deadlock. It took the leadership of the Senate to do it. We've got to continue to show that leadership. And we have to hope that the Speaker of the House of Representatives and other members as well will watch carefully as the American people react. Will watch carefully and understand their responsibility now to work with us in a bipartisan fashion to solve our problems. One of the saddest parts of today was to pick up the morning paper and read Republican House members say, well, we won this battle. Honest to goodness, how can they possibly say that? This is not a win when it comes to the losses of federal employees and the services across our country. We have to come up with real victories for the American people to help this economy move forward and create jobs, to solve the problems that face us. That's why we were sent here. I want to thank Harry Reid, my colleagues, Senators Schumer and Murray. Many of us take credit, but the lion's share of the credit goes to this man from Searchlight, Nevada. I can't get over his determination, his patience, and his energy throughout this. You'll never know, you will never know how much he put in to make this a success. And Senator McConnell, who stepped up to be his partner when it really counted. So I'm happy for the Senate tonight. I'm happy for the nation. But let us make sure that this is just the beginning.
Well, thank you. Today is not a happy day, an ebullient day. It's a somber day. We finally achieved our goal, but frankly, we ended up where we started. When we started, we said we would do three things: fund the government, pay our bills, and agree to negotiate. We started there, and that's where we ended up. That's exactly what the law does, no more, no less. And so the bottom line is millions suffered. Millions didn't get paychecks. The economy was dragged down. And confidence and faith in the United States credit and in the United States itself around the world was shaken. So this is not a happy day. It's a somber day. Because at the end of the day, we never should have gone through what we went through. We started here, we ended here. Second point, there are three people, I think, who I'd like to praise. We can't do it enough. The first, of course, is our leader, Harry Reid. He stood so firm from the beginning. It was his resolve. We could not bow to the kind of tactics that were being used by the small minority on the other side. He was stalwart. He never buckled. He never flinched. He never doubted. He gave strength to the rest of us, and the whole caucus was united behind him. Second, I'd like to praise the President. The President, again, in every time that we saw him, and every time that we dealt with him, was stalwart from the beginning, realizing that the kind of tactics, if used by the other side, and permitted to be used by the other side, would be used again and again and again. And finally, my hat goes off to Senator McConnell. He's in a very difficult situation politically. And once he saw that Speaker Boehner and the House were tied in a total knot, he knew he had the obligation to step up, even if it might hurt him in his campaign. I respect that. I think every one of my Democratic colleagues respects that. And it's something that I'll remember. Final point. If there's a silver lining in this gray cloud, it is that the politics, the reckless politics of brinksmanship has reached its peak. That is what we hope, and that is what I believe. It was shown that brinksmanship doesn't work if the other side will not give in. When a small faction says that I'm going to hurt a whole lot of people unless you give in to me, the temptation of good-hearted, good-minded people is to give in because innocent people are being hurt. But unfortunately, if we gave in this time, we'd be back doing the same thing next quarter, and the quarter after that, and the quarter after that, and the brinksmanship would get worse. The kind of politics where they put a gun to your head and say, unless you do what I want to do, what I want you to do, I'm going to hurt a whole lot of people. And yet, tonight in the Senate, and hopefully in the House, a large group of the other party for the first time stood up to the brinksmanship. And it is our hope, indeed it's our prayer, that that brinksmanship has reached its peak, and that we can go back to the normal way of legislating, where every side compromises and we produce a product that is good for the American people. With Patty's leadership, I'm hopeful that can start in the budget negotiations, which will start immediately. I'm hopeful it could occur in the House on immigration. And I'm hopeful it could occur in both bodies on the major issues facing us. If brinksmanship has peaked, if the kind of politics we have unfortunately witnessed over the last several years recedes, and a politics of comity and compromise starts rising, then maybe these awful 3 weeks would have been worth it.
Senator Murray.
Well, tonight I am delighted to join this leadership team who has worked so hard, and my hat's off to Senator Reid for his tremendous work and passion, as well as my colleagues, Senator Sherman and Durbin, who never gave up, who stood up for our families and communities that are hurting, and tonight we join with all of them, breathing a sigh of relief. It took far too long. Far too many families were hurt while we worked to end this crisis, but there's finally a light at the end of the tunnel. Here in the Senate, as you saw tonight, Democrats and Republicans worked together on a path out of this crisis. Doesn't solve every problem today, but the path we are on will now open the government, take the threat of default off the table, and allow Democrats and Republicans to now get in a room and negotiate without asking the American people to pay the price. I'm very glad personally that after 6 months of going out on the floor time and time again and asking to go to budget conference 21 times before this, we are finally now in an agreement to work towards a bipartisan budget negotiation. The budgets that passed the House and the Senate 6 months ago are very different. There's no doubt about it. Nobody thinks it's going to be easy to get to a deal. But I will tell you, I would not have fought so hard for so long to get in a room with Chairman Ryan if I didn't think we could find common ground and work something out. I know that Democrats are willing to compromise to get a deal, and I'm hopeful Republicans will as well. Now that Republicans have seen the consequences of a government shutdown, I don't think they're going to be anxious to repeat this again. And now that it's clear that the debt limit is going to be raised and can't be used to extract political concessions, any future threats will ring hollow. So as we now head into the next phase, the budget conference, to have an actual negotiation, we will have a negotiation, not a hostage situation. I know there are budget changes Republicans want, and there are budget changes that we want. And I think we can now work together towards a deal that solves these problems from both sides. And I think for all of us, most importantly, stop lurching from crisis to crisis. So I'm very proud of the Senate tonight for working together and to stand up to end the pain of the American people and go to work on the bipartisan negotiations. And that we're finally going to do exactly what we said all along. We're going to open the government, we're going to pay our bills, and then we're going to sit down and we are going to negotiate.
Going to be not too many questions answered tonight. I want to go watch the ball game.
I have a question for Senator Durbin, actually.
Okay.
Start out. There's an appropriations anomaly in this bill that is on a dam that's on the Ohio River contiguous with Illinois. Can you explain why that is in this piece of legislation?
I can just tell you, I want to make matter of record. I did not ask for that.
I know. Senator Feinstein is.
Okay, everybody. I thought this might come. This is not an earmark. It saves the money, the taxpayers, lots of money. It enables the Corps of Engineers to continue a project. Had we not done this so-called anomaly, the Corps of Engineers would have had to spend before the last day of December $80 million to stop the project. This project has been ongoing since 1988. The purpose of it is to construction of some locks and a dam that was initiated in the 1930s. It's a replacement. So there's no need to point fingers at anyone other than we save the taxpayers tonight about $80 billion. It does nothing to the running up the deficit. It's in fact save the government money. You didn't mind if I answered your question, did you?
Did very well. Okay.
Senator, you're meeting with Chairman Ryan tomorrow. What is your expectation from that?
I asked Chairman Ryan to meet with me tomorrow morning. We're just going to have breakfast and start to begin some conversations about how we move forward from here.
We're going to have breakfast at Tortilla Factory.
No. No, we are not.
Okay. Good night. Good night, everybody.
Okay.
To recap, the Senate passed and sent through the House legislation to avoid a national default and end a 16-day government shutdown, along the terms set by President Obama. Now, the President spoke in the White House briefing room after the Senate vote, saying that if the House approves the bill, he'll sign it immediately.
Almost let Jay out. Good evening, everybody. Tonight, the Republicans and Democrats in Congress have come together around an agreement that will reopen our government and remove the threat of default from our economy. The Senate has now voted to approve this agreement, and Democrats and Republicans in the House still have an important vote to take. But I want to thank the leaders of both parties for getting us to this point. Once this agreement arrives on my desk, I will sign it immediately. We'll begin reopening our government immediately. And we can begin to lift this cloud of uncertainty and unease from our businesses and from the American people. I'll have more to say about this tomorrow, and I've got some thoughts about how we can move forward in the remainder of the year and stay focused on the job at hand. Because there's a lot of work ahead of us, including our need to earn back the trust of the American people that's been lost over the last few weeks. And we can begin to do that by addressing the real issues that they care about. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I'm willing to work with anybody. I am eager to work with anybody, Democrat or Republican, House or Senate members, on any idea that will grow our economy, create new jobs, strengthen the middle class, and get our fiscal house in order for the long term. I've never believed that Democrats have a monopoly on good ideas, and despite the differences over the issue of shutting down our government, I'm convinced that Democrats and Republicans can work together to make progress for America. In fact, there are things that we know will help strengthen our economy that we could get done before this year is out. We still need to pass a law to fix our broken immigration system. We still need to pass a farm bill. And with the shutdown behind us and budget committees forming, we now have an opportunity to focus on a sensible budget that is responsible, that is fair, and that helps hardworking people all across this country. And we could get all these things done even this year if everybody comes together in a spirit of how are we going to move this country forward and put the last 3 weeks behind us. That's what I believe the American people are looking for, not a focus on politics, not a focus on elections, but a focus on the concrete steps that can improve their lives. That's going to be my focus. I'm looking forward to Congress doing the same. But once again, I want to thank the leadership for coming together and getting this done. Hopefully next time it won't be in the 11th hour. One of the things that I said throughout this process is we've got to get out of the habit of governing by crisis. And my hope and expectation is everybody has learned that there's no reason why we can't work on the issues at hand, why we can't disagree between the parties while still being agreeable, and make sure that we're not inflicting harm on the American people when we do have disagreements. So hopefully that's a lesson that will be internalized, and not just by me, but also by Democrats and Republicans, not only the leaders, but also the rank and file. Thanks very much, everybody.
Mr. President, isn't this going to happen all over again in a few months?
No.
And Rebecca Shabbat of The Hill tweets that President Obama will deliver another statement tomorrow just after 10:30 a.m. from the State Dining Room on the deal to reopen the government and lift the debt ceiling. The Senate vote tonight was a bipartisan 81-18. Some of those no votes, Senators Scott, Sessions, and Shelby, and also Senators Toomey and Vitter. The House is back in session. They came back in around 9:20 Eastern and must still vote on the bill, which you can see live on C-SPAN. On the other side of the Capitol, the House is debating the measure passed by the Senate tonight to get the federal government operating again and avoid a default on the national debt. A spokesman for Majority Leader Cantor says we expect the House to vote sometime between 9:55 p.m. and 10:10 p.m. The vote time subject